You buy an old house because you see potential. You see character and crown molding and a price you can barely afford. You don't see the silence it holds or the history buried in its bones. Our house on Elm Street in the historic district of Savannah, Georgia, was a foreclosure. A steal, our realtor said. She didn't mention why the previous owners had abandoned it so quickly, leaving behind furniture and a layer of dust. We were too excited to ask. The first thing I noticed, after the gorgeous wraparound porch and the peeling paint, were the basement windows. They were the old single-pane kind, set into crumbling stone foundations, and on every one of them, on the inside, were heavy, wrought iron security bars. They were bolted directly into the stone, not with modern screws, but with thick, rust-spotted iron bolts. They seemed excessive, paranoid. My wife, Sarah, hated them immediately. They make the place look like a prison. Alex, and they're on the inside? That's weird. The first thing we should do is take them down. I agreed, but between moving boxes, starting new jobs, and the sheer exhaustion of it all, the basement bars became just another part of the house's landscape. A tomorrow project. The basement itself was a classic Georgia crawl space, damp, smelling of earth and decay, with a low, cobweb festoon ceiling, the kind of place you only go to reset the circuit breaker or haul out the Christmas decorations. The barred windows cast long, zebra-striped shadows across the dirt floor when the afternoon sun hit them just right. The first oddity was the temperature. No matter the season, the basement was always 10 degrees colder than the rest of the house, a deep, damp cold that seeped into your bones. The second was the sound. Sometimes late at night, I'd hear a faint, metallic tink from down there. I wrote it off as the house settling or the pipes contracting. Then, one night about a month in, I was up late working. The house was silent, and from the basement, clear as a bell, came a sound that froze my fingers on the keyboard. It was a slow, deliberate scrape, drag, scrape, drag, like something heavy being pulled across the concrete floor. My heart hammered. I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the top of the basement stairs, my hand hovering on the doorknob. The sound stopped the moment my fingers touched the cold metal. I stood there for a full 5 minutes, hearing nothing but my own pulse in my ears. I didn't go down. I told myself it was a branch rubbing against the house, even though I knew there were no trees on that side. The next morning, I went down to investigate. Nothing was out of place. The old armchair was where we'd left it. The stack of boxes was untouched. But as I turned to leave, my flashlight beam caught one of the basement windows. This one was at the back of the house, looking out under the porch into the narrow, dark gap between our foundation and the fence. The inside of the glass was smeared, not with dust, but with a thick, greasy film. And pressed into the grime on the other side of the glass, on the outside, were 2 perfect, child-sized handprints. My blood ran cold. I rushed outside and crouched down to look. The window well was filled with dead leaves and stagnant water. There was no way a child could have gotten down there without making a mess, without leaving footprints. And the handprints, they were on the outside of the glass, but the security bars were on the inside. Whatever made those prints had been in the well, looking in, while I was protected or trapped inside by the very bars I'd considered removing. I cleaned the window, my hands shaking. I didn't tell Sarah. She was already jumpy in the new house. That night, the sound started earlier. It wasn't a scrape anymore. It was a soft, wet padding sound. Then, a faint, rhythmic tapping. I went to the top of the basement stairs again, listening. The tapping was coming from one of the windows. It was a pattern, like a little game. I flipped the light switch. The single, bare bulb flickered on, illuminating the grim space. The tapping stopped. I saw nothing but the stripes of shadow from the bars. I was about to turn away when movement caught my eye. At the far window, the one I'd cleaned, a shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness outside and pressed against the glass. It was small, a silhouette, a child's head with unkempt hair. It just stood there, looking in. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. I slammed the basement door shut and locked it, something we never did. The next day, I went to the city records office. I had to know. The clerk, an older woman with tired eyes, helped me pull the file for our address. The previous owners were a family named Phelps. They'd left in a hurry, but it was an earlier record that made my skin crawl. A news article from 1952. Microfiche blurry on the screen. Local boy vanishes. The headline read, Timothy Marsh, age 7, reported missing by his mother. Last seen playing in the backyard of his family's Elm Street home. Search yields no clues. The house description was ours. I felt a wave of nausea. I scrolled further. There was a follow-up article, a week later. The mother, distraught, had told police she heard him tapping on his bedroom window at night. She told them she'd find his handprints on the outside of the basement glass in the morning. They dismissed it as the grief of a broken woman. The case was never solved. I drove home in a trance. It was all making a horrible, twisted sense. The bars weren't to keep something out. The previous owners had installed them because they knew. They knew what was already inside. The bars were to keep it in the basement. That night, I confessed everything to Sarah. The sounds, the handprints, the article. She listened, her face pale. We agreed to never, ever go into the basement again. We would seal the door. But as we lay in bed, trying to sleep, a new sound drifted up through the floorboards. It wasn't a tap or a scrape. It was a voice. A small, thin, watery voice. "I'm cold," it whispered. "Let me in." We bolted upright. The voice was coming from the heating vent in the floor. "The bars are in the way," the voice whined, now with a petulant, angry edge. "You put the bars in the way." We spent the rest of the night in a hotel. The next morning, we called a priest. He walked through the house, stopped at the basement door, and refused to go down. He said the presence wasn't confined to the basement anymore. It had been invited, he said, by our attention, by our fear. He blessed the house, but he looked uneasy. We put the house back on the market a week later. We took a massive financial loss. We told the realtor it was because of plumbing issues. The last time I was in that house, alone, packing the final boxes, I stood at the basement door. I had to know. I had to see. I slowly turned the knob and cracked the door. The basement was dark, but from the bottom of the stairs, I could see the row of windows. The afternoon sun was shining outside, but down there, it was perpetual twilight. And at that far window, the one with the handprints, a small figure was standing. Its back was to me, looking out through the glass, but its reflection was caught in the dirty pane. It wasn't a child. Its face was pale and smooth. Its eyes were dark, empty pools, and it was smiling a wide, impossibly long smile at its own reflection. It raised one small pale hand and began to tap softly on the glass. Then its reflection shifted, and its dark eyes in the window glass met mine. The tapping stopped. The smile widened. We moved. We never went back. But sometimes, in the dead of night, in our new, modern home with no basement, I'll jolt awake. I'll think I hear a faint, metallic tink from the crawl space, and I'll lie there, paralyzed, praying that I remembered to check the windows, praying that the things we lock out stay out, and praying even harder that the things we locked in that house on Elm Street never learned how to follow us home. The house on Hemlock Drive was perfect. It was the kind of suburban dream my parents had scraped and saved for. A sprawling backyard, a quiet cul-de-sac, a finished basement for me to use as a teenage sanctuary. The only oddity, the one piece that didn't fit the idyllic puzzle, were the basement windows. They were narrow, horizontal slices of glass set just above the soil line, designed to let a little light into the finished rec room. And on each one, on the outside, were heavy-gauge steel security bars, bolted deep into the concrete foundation. My dad, ever the pragmatist, saw it as a bonus. "See that, Leo? No one's getting in through there. Peace of mind." I saw it as a cage. The bars made the basement feel like a bunker, cutting the room off from the world. The view from my new sanctuary was a grid of steel and a sliver of grass, the legs of passing pedestrians, and the undercarriages of cars. The previous owners, an elderly couple named Adler, had left in a hurry. Our realtor said it was a sudden move to a retirement community in Arizona, but the neighbors told a different story. Whispers at the block party. Old man Adler had become a recluse, paranoid. He'd installed the bars himself, they said. After his wife passed, he'd told Mr. Henderson next door that he was tired of the things looking in at him. I dismissed it as the ramblings of a lonely old man. I was 15. My world was video games and guitar practice, not neighborhood gossip. The first few nights were fine. Then the sounds started. It began with the scratching, a faint, skittering sound from the other side of the basement's exterior wall. We had a cat, Mittens, so we blamed her, but the scratching had a rhythm to it, not random. Sometimes it was 3 slow drags, then a pause, then 2 quick taps. I pressed my ear to the paneled wall, my heart thudding. The sound would stop. The moment I stepped back, it would start again, a little closer, moving along the wall towards the windows. One Tuesday, I was down there late, trying to master a tricky guitar riff. I had my back to the windows. The room was dark, lit only by a single lamp. I hit a wrong note and stopped. In the sudden silence, I heard a different sound. Breathing. Wet, labored breathing. It wasn't coming from the room. It was coming from outside the window. I froze, my fingers cemented to the guitar strings. Slowly, so slowly, I turned my head. The window was just a black rectangle, the bars stark against the night. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw a shape blotting out the little bit of ambient light from the street lamp. Something was pressed against the glass. It was a face, not a human face. It was pale and distorted, flattened against the pane. I couldn't make out features, just a sickly white oval and 2 dark, soulless pits where I should have been. The wet, rasping breath was fogging the glass from the other side. I screamed and scrambled upstairs, tripping on the last step. My parents came running. By the time my dad, armed with a flashlight and a baseball bat, marched outside to check, there was nothing there, just damp grass under the window. An animal, Leo, my dad said, his voice tight with forced calm. A possum, maybe. Its reflection, the shadows, it can play tricks on you. But there were no paw prints in the soft earth, only a single, deep indentation, as if someone had been kneeling there for a long, long time. The incidents escalated. My mom's prized rose bushes under the windows were found torn up, the roots exposed and gnawed. Our garbage cans were repeatedly knocked over, the bags ripped open, not for food, but for things like used coffee grounds and eggshells, which were scattered in strange, ritualistic patterns. I started having dreams, vivid, suffocating dreams, where I was trapped in the basement, and the thing outside was patiently, methodically using its bare hands to dig. I'd wake up to the sound of dirt hitting the window wells, but when I'd look, the ground was untouched. I became obsessed. I set up my old baby monitor, pointing the camera at the largest basement window. For 2 nights, nothing. On the 3rd night, I was jolted awake by a burst of static from the parent unit on my nightstand. The screen was a mess of digital snow, but through the distortion, a shape was visible. The thing was back. It wasn't just looking in. It had its fingers curled around the steel bars, testing their strength. Its head was cocked, and those dark eye pits seemed to be staring directly into the camera lens. A low, guttural whisper filtered through the static. A single word stretched into a hiss. Out. I showed the recording to my parents the next morning. The color drained from my mother's face. My father, for the first time, looked truly afraid. He called a security company that afternoon. The technician, a burly man named Vince, surveyed the bars. "Huh," he grunted. "These weren't installed to keep people out." "What do you mean?" my dad asked. Vince pointed at the bolts. "See how they're angled? The threading is on the outside. These were put on from out here. You'd need a special tool to remove them from the inside. Standard security bars have the bolts on the interior, so the homeowner can take them off in case of a fire. These were made to keep something in." The silence in the room was heavier than any I'd ever felt. Old man Adler's words echoed in my head, tired of the things looking in at me. He hadn't been trying to keep intruders out. He'd been trying to contain his wife, or what his wife had become. We moved out a week later. We stayed in a long-term hotel while my parents fought with the bank and the realtors. We never spent another night in that house. A year later, I was driving past the old neighborhood with a friend. I couldn't help but turn down Hemlock Drive. The house was still on the market, a faded for sale sign swaying in the overgrown lawn. And there, in the basement window, the steel bars were still in place. But as I slowed the car, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. Pushed up against the glass, from the inside, were two small, pale hands. A child's hands. And above them, a young face I didn't recognize. Its eyes wide with a terror I knew all too well. It was a new family. They must have moved in briefly, then fled. The bars hadn't kept the thing out. They had failed at their original horrible purpose. They were just a cage now, and the new occupants had discovered what lived in the dark space behind the furnace. In the crawl space no one ever checked. I hit the gas and sped away. I never looked back. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I'll wake up thinking I hear it, the soft, wet sound of breathing right outside my own bedroom window. And I know, with a certainty that chills me to my soul, that it's not looking in anymore. It's waiting for me to come out. We moved into the Miller Place house because it was a steal, a mid-century modern, tucked away in the woods outside Asheville, North Carolina. The realtor called it architectural integrity. My wife Lena called it character. I just called it quiet, or so I thought. The quiet was the first thing I noticed. It wasn't peaceful. It was a thick, heavy silence, broken only by the creak of the floorboards under our feet and the wind in the tall pines. But on our second night, as we lay in the master bedroom, I heard it, a low, steady hum. It was barely audible, a vibration more than a sound, felt in the teeth and the bones. I nudged Lena. "Do you hear that?" She listened for a moment, then shook her head. "It's the fridge, David, or the power lines. Go to sleep." But it wasn't the fridge. I got up and walked through the dark house, my ear to the walls like a safecracker. The hum was everywhere and nowhere. It seemed to emanate from the very structure itself. I ended up in the living room, staring at the large, fieldstone fireplace that was the home's centerpiece. I pressed my hand against the cold, rough stone. The vibration was strongest there. I'm an engineer. I believe in systems, in logic, in cause and effect. I spent the next week diagnosing the problem. I shut off the main power at the breaker. The hum remained. I had the water main inspected. Nothing. I even called the power company to check for stray voltage in the ground. They found nothing. The hum was a constant, maddening companion, a bass note to our new lives. Lena started having migraines. She said it felt like pressure building behind her eyes. She couldn't hear the hum, she insisted, but she could feel it. Our 2-year-old daughter Chloe began having night terrors. She'd wake up screaming, pointing at the wall of her nursery and babbling about the man in the stones. That's when the fear began to curdle in my stomach. I started digging into the history of the house. It was designed in 1962 by a reclusive architect named Alastair Finch. He was a pioneer of geopathic architecture, a fringe theory that buildings could be harmonized with the Earth's natural energy lines. The local library had a small, dusty file on him. Most of it was technical jargon about ley lines and resonant frequencies. But one article, a short, sensational piece from 1974, made my blood run cold. Architect's final project remains a mystery. The headline read, "Finch had disappeared, not a trace." The police investigation was inconclusive. His last known project was the Miller Place house, built for a client who, records showed, never moved in. The house had stood empty for over a decade before being sold. The article quoted a former associate. "Alastair became obsessed," the man said. "He wasn't just building on a ley line. He told me he was going to tune the house to it, to amplify the Earth's frequency. He said he wanted to hear the planet sing." I drove home, the words echoing in my head, amplify the frequency. That night, the hum was louder. It had changed, too. It was no longer a single note, but a discordant chord. a dissonant vibration that set my teeth on edge. Lena was in bed, with a cold compress over her eyes. Chloe was crying inconsolably in her room, refusing to be near the wall shared with the fireplace. I went down to the living room, a sick feeling of certainty growing in me. I stood before the fireplace. The stones were no longer cold. They were faintly warm to the touch. The hum was a physical force now, a throbbing pulse in the air. I noticed something I hadn't before. One of the stones, a dark, smooth piece of basalt near the base, didn't look quite right. Its edges were too perfect. There was no mortar around it. I got a crowbar from the garage. With a grating screech, the stone pivoted inward. It wasn't a stone at all, but a perfectly crafted lid. Behind it was a dark, narrow cavity. A wave of hot, metallic-smelling air washed over me. The hum was deafening now, a physical pressure in my skull. I shone my phone's flashlight into the hole. The cavity wasn't empty. Wires, thick and copper, were woven through the structure like a metallic nervous system. They converged on a central, cylindrical device made of a strange coppery alloy. It was covered in dials and switches, all frozen in place by time and dust. It looked like a bizarre, homemade tuning fork, and nestled at the base of the device, held in place by the wires, was a skeleton. It was small, curled in a fetal position. The bones were stained green from the copper. One skeletal hand was clutched around a small, tarnished silver locket. I stumbled back, gasping. This wasn't a house, it was a resonator. A giant architectural instrument designed to amplify the hum of the earth itself. And Alistair Finch hadn't disappeared. He had become part of his machine, the final, terrible component needed to complete his insane symphony. The hum reached a crescendo, a shrieking, metallic wail that felt like it was tearing my mind apart. The light bulbs in the living room flared bright white and exploded. From upstairs, I heard Chloe scream, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. I scrambled up the stairs. Lena was stumbling out of our room, her hands over her ears, blood trickling from her nose. "I can hear it," she shrieked. "I can hear it now." I burst into Chloe's room. She was standing in her crib, pointing a trembling finger at the wall. The wallpaper was vibrating, and then the plaster began to crack. Not randomly, but in a precise spiderweb pattern, radiating out from a central point. As I watched, a long, thin crack formed that looked unmistakably like a human silhouette, its arms outstretched, its head thrown back in a silent scream. We got out. We left everything. We spent the night in a motel 20 miles away. The three of us huddled in one bed, jumping at every sound. We sold the Miller Place house for a massive loss to a property developer who didn't believe in ghosts, only in square footage. He called me a week after the demolition started. "You'll never believe what we found in that fireplace," he said, his voice a mix of disgust and awe. "Some kind of weird wiring, and bones. Human bones. Crazy, huh?" I just hung up. We live in a new build apartment now, all drywall and laminate floors. There's no character, no history, and most importantly, no hum. What sometimes, when the city is perfectly still and the wind is just right, I'll feel a faint, almost imperceptible vibration through the floor, and I'll lie awake, staring at the blank, featureless wall, waiting for the first crack to appear. Because I know now that a sound, once amplified, never truly dies. It just waits for the right silence to be heard again.